In this lesson, we'll take a look at some of the attributes that we can use to help control the overall appearance and the behavior of our simulated nCloth. So what we're going to be looking at is some of the attributes that we can find if we select our nCloth object, and if we go into the nCloth shape node, some of the things that we can find underneath the collisions. We'll talk about some of these options in our next lesson. For us in this lesson, we're going to talk mostly about some of the options found in these dynamic properties. So this is where we can start to really control things like the stretchiness of our cloth object, how much it's able to compress or how much it's able to resist any sort of compression, any dampening, rigidity, and things like that. Now, a lot of these values, you can get away with only really kind of messing with a handful of these. There are definitely a lot of attributes here, but depending on whether or not you're simulating some kind of a cloth object, or maybe something that is maybe a soft sort of metal that can dent, that may depend on whether or not you're going to use some of these. We're not going to talk about all of these necessarily in this lesson, but I will go through and show you some of the ones that you're probably going to be working with most commonly and having to adjust. Okay, so if you remember from one of our earlier lessons, this scene is actually modeled out in centimeters, which means we've had to take our nucleus node and we had to take our scale attributes and bring that space scale down to 0.01. Now, once we do that, there are actually a couple of really important options that we need to adjust inside of the nCloth in order to compensate for that. So, if we come in and just simply play this back, everything looks, for the most part, pretty normal. Not just a whole lot of weirdness here. But let's come in, and I'll rewind back to the beginning of my timeline, and I'll take this cloth object and maybe just angle this a little bit, so that way it sort of falls down, maybe not necessarily just flat on this chair, but maybe is able to crumple up just a little bit. Now, let's come in and play that back. Okay, now we start to see something a little weird. As we start to play this back, my cloth is sort of falling off at this odd angle. Now, this happens whenever we, again, take our nucleus node and scale that down to 0.01. If we come back into our nCloth shape, once we set this nucleus to 0.01, back in our cloth shape, we want to come in and start to adjust this lift attribute. Now, this will work just fine if your scene is modeled in meters, but again, since this is not, we're going to have to take this and sort of compensate for that smaller nucleus space scale. So that lift, we're going to take that down to something like 0.0001. There we are. Now let's rewind and play that back. There we go. That's behaving much better. So probably one of the single most important attributes that you can adjust inside of this nCloth shape, if you've taken your nucleus, set the space scale to 0.01, always make sure you take this lift and set it to something like 0.001. Or in my case, I've actually set it to 0.0001. Now, once we do that, as we can see, again, our cloth is now falling much more naturally. If we take a look at what we have, though, there's a lot of stretching. You can see this almost sort of looks like spandex material, where it's really stretching and really warping out of shape. So this becomes another fairly common problem as we start to take our nucleus and bring that down. So we're going to take our stretch resistance. This is what I'm going to work with. The higher this value goes, the more of this stretching we can start to eliminate. So depending on your needs, this slider starts to max out at a value of 200, but we could actually overdrive this to any value that we want. For most situations, though, I find that this value of 200 is going to be pretty good for cloth objects that we want to try to eliminate stretching as much as possible. So we can come through here, let that play. There we go. So maybe still a little bit of stretching, but overall that stretching that we get is very minimized. Okay, very nice. So stretch is probably one of the second most important options that you're going to have to adjust. I find that for most simulations, I almost always wind up having to bring this up to prevent stretching and other things like that. Now the other thing that we have is this compression resistance. Now this again is another one of these values where the higher it goes, the more this cloth is going to try to resist any sort of compression or squishing. It's going to try to hold its shape a little bit more. Now for certain objects this could be useful, but for cloth objects you may actually find yourself wanting to take this down a little bit. So that way we don't get any, or at least we don't get as much springiness and things like that in the cloth results. That can sometimes help to eliminate bouncing and other sorts of odd springiness that you can sometimes wind up with. So there we go. So let that simulate through for just a second. Okay, very nice. Okay, so let's get back in there. For the most part, when it comes to simulating most types of cloth, I really find that I can get most of what I'm looking for by taking the stretch resistance and starting to play with that, playing with the compression resistance, and most importantly, adjusting that lift. Now some of these other ones, again, are going to be really fairly specialized, and some you may not ever touch at all. But when it comes to simulating the type of cloth that you want, like I said, a lot of times I find that you can get pretty good results just with these three attributes. Now before we wrap up, let's go ahead and we'll take just a few minutes to set up our scene for the next lesson. So what I'd like to do now is take this cloth object, and instead of just having it fall straight down, let's come in and maybe give it just a little bit of a different direction. So let's come down. I'll maybe take this cloth, sort of pull that forward from the chair, and turn this a little bit more to the side. Okay, now what I'd like to do is try to get this cloth sort of like it's a towel that's just sort of been thrown onto the chair. So what we could do is take our nCloth shape. Let's take a look at the local force. Now to make this a little bit easier, I'm actually going to set some keyframes for this. So what I'll do is select this nCloth shape here inside my outliner, and that way any sort of keyframes that I set down here will show up in my timeline. So looking at the overall direction here, we have our z-axis. Now we'd probably need this cloth to move along the negative z if we want it to move toward the chair, so I'll set that to maybe -10 and let that play through. Okay, so it's at least moving in the right direction. Let's maybe get it moving up a little bit as well. So let's maybe give that a local force of something like 5 in the y. Okay, that should work out pretty well. Might even give that a little bit more height in the local y.